All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Managing for Small Acreage Properties for Wildlife webinar. My name is Avalon Powell. I am the Senior Marketing Coordinator for Plateau, and I will be assisting our presenter, Plateau Senior Wildlife Biologist Tucker Slack, with moderating questions during the open Q&A this evening. So this webinar is scheduled for approximately an hour. We're going to provide an overview of fragmentation in Texas, discuss some different management techniques and activities landowners can utilize, and then touch on some wildlife management cooperatives and how they can benefit your management. At the end, we will open it up to your questions. However, feel free to submit those at any time. To do that, you'll need to use the Q&A feature of Zoom. So to access that, you should simply be able to scroll over your Zoom screen and you'll see a toolbar that pops up at either the top or the bottom of the screen. And on that toolbar is an option for Q&A. If you click that, it will actually open a separate pop-up box that you can type your questions directly in. After the webinar, we will be providing you a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the slides in a follow-up email. And if you think of any follow-up questions at that time, please feel free to respond to us and we're happy to get back to you then. So without further ado, Tucker, feel free to take it away.
All right, thank you, Avalon. Thank you, guys. I want to thank everyone for taking the opportunity to be here to listen to what we have to say. I hope this is valuable and that you can glean something from it. I'll tell you, you pay for the whole seat, but you're only going to need the front half of it. So we're going to rock and roll. We're going to run through quite a lot of materials and activities. I do plan to leave several minutes at the end for questions, and we can address some of those more specific questions that you may have at that time. As Avalon mentioned, my name is Tucker Slack. I'm a senior wildlife biologist in what we consider our Pines and Prairies region, primarily East Texas. And so we'll just kind of get rolling. Maybe we'll get rolling here.
Were your arrows not working today, Tucker?
Yeah, it was working a moment ago. There we go. So what we're going to talk about, this is just kind of a general overview of the agenda. She already mentioned, you know, we've got the land trends, the fragmentation, talk a little bit about wildlife management, a section on kind of how do we get started, you know, where do you start? And then the last section will be more specific activities related to small acreage. We'll also dive into some specific details on some of these management cooperatives and wildlife management associations and things like that. So first, we're going to be looking at land trends and fragmentation. This is just a short section, an introduction, situation that all of us probably are very familiar with, and just kind of explaining some of what's going on and some of why that's pertinent to this discussion that we're having tonight. Everyone knows, and we all see the urban expansion and extreme population growth throughout Texas. These numbers may be a little dated. I updated to the most recent I could find was 2019 on some of these large scale statewide numbers. Essentially, Texas is 95% privately owned, which comes to about 142 million acres throughout the state. That excludes water, which was almost 5 million acres throughout the state. Also, it excludes a lot of your metro areas that are covered in concrete. So that 142 million acres is all land that is privately owned, primarily open land, used for residences, but also used for many, many other purposes. They're projecting the growth of the Texas population to 45 million people by 2050. That's a tremendous number of folks. You know, the land's really changing, the use is changing. The ownership is changing. So that brings us to the next point here, this ownership fragmentation. And the main point in that is we all know over time, the size of these properties is becoming smaller, you know, for several reasons, which we'll discuss some of. But that doesn't necessarily equate to habitat fragmentation. So those are essentially two different metrics. One being different people own the land, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the habitat has changed or decreased in value. Particularly when you start talking about cooperative efforts of management on a larger scale between several different landowners, you can still have a pretty good impact regardless of who owns the land, depending on management objectives and kind of how you go about setting those. So the property values, I just showed this one primarily because the averages, and this is driving a lot of what's going on with Texas. It's driving a lot of the transition to wildlife management as a land use, as far as the tax valuation. Statewide average throughout Texas, almost $3,000 an acre. Just a little over a decade ago, it was about $2,000 an acre. And particularly in this Gulf Coast, Brazos Bottom area, denoted on the map here, the average property value is almost $6,400 an acre. And over the last decade, that's jumped up quite a bit from almost $4,000 an acre a little over a decade ago. So some of these land valuation, the property values, that's driving a lot of this ownership fragmentation. It's driving a lot of what's going on, but it's also driving a lot of folks to look for alternative uses for their land. As it gets smaller, property becomes more valuable. That may change the primary use. Here's another pretty interesting look at some of what's going on with the population, not to beat a dead horse, but the Lambert map, it kind of shows based on the colors where those population centers are. I really like this anamorphic map because it shows a little bit more information to me. I'm a very visual person. So you can see where those hubs of population density really are. We're looking at the Golden Triangle. We've got Harris County, the Houston Metroplex, DFW Metroplex, and even the Hill Country in San Antonio. So those are kind of the areas that are excessively growing. And honestly, just kind of looking at it, these red areas probably look a lot like the top picture, whereas the yellow and light green areas look more like the bottom picture. The landscape has changed in Texas and will continue to do so, which brings about a lot of changes. Demographics, there's just several things that are in a state of flux right now throughout the state of Texas. So now, I think we're all aware of that. That just kind of sets the stage for some of this wildlife management, and even maybe a good segue into why this is important, why it's growing. Why did this even come about? So in 1995, there was a state amendment to the Constitution that allowed for 1D1W, wildlife management tax valuation. This is just one of several different open space tax valuations in Texas. Traditional ag, which is cattle, it's grazing lands, possibly it could be hay production. It now includes beekeeping as of some recent changes. Beekeeping has a little more stipulation on when and where it can be applied, and some pretty intense, rigorous standards to meet. But wildlife management, timber management, those essentially are the list of open space valuations. Just another map over here, it shows kind of the population growth rate as far as a percent change. You'll notice the dark maroonish brown color is over 100. So that will be over 100% increase as far as the growth rates of the population in those counties that are marked out. And that's from 2010 to 2060. So that's a 50-year time frame, but you see where those areas of growth are. Just another important thing to look at is to why, why is all this happening? Well, part of it has to do with a different change in who owns the property and who's buying properties, maybe even the reasons why. A lot more non-resident landowners, people are buying properties for recreation, maybe investment, whatever the purpose, but they're not necessarily buying these properties to try to make a living farming, ranching, historical agricultural uses, even timber production and things like that. It could also have to do with age, ability, and generational transfer. So maybe your family's owned this land for a long time. Maybe your grandparents farmed it. Maybe your parents farmed it. Maybe you don't want to do that. The abilities are different. In our changing society, people have a different set of skills and abilities. They may not be necessarily inclined or equipped to deal with the rigors of traditional agriculture. Maybe they don't want to build fence. They don't want to mess with trees, whatever the differences may be. Some of this is driven just by changing people, different generations, the transfer is there. Maybe the people still want to maintain the land. They don't necessarily want to run cows, or it could be in order to maintain that, you've got to run so many cattle that you feel like you're raising cattle at the expense of the land. And that's a big thing too. A lot of times people want to do things that are giving back, something that's bigger. Honestly, it's just something different. It fits in really well. This wildlife management does with a lot of things people already want to do. And so kind of a lot of the thought process might be, well, look, if we're going to work we're going to have to work on this, it might as well be doing something that we want to do. You know, the type of work is a little more fun sometimes than maintaining fences for cattle or fixing a fence at 2 a.m. Probably not going to have to fill a bird feeder at 2 a.m. You know, so just a little bit different. Although this kind of brings me to a good point of preservation versus conservation. And so those are two words that kind of get thrown around, have very different meanings. You know, the conservation denotes action on your part. So in conservation, you're actively doing things to make it better. This whole wildlife management program is geared around conservation. Preservation is more of letting the land go to its own devices. And those are two very different things. So another reason, you know, and I think a lot of the properties fall into this, is these kind of marginal agricultural lands. You know, maybe it's restricted in size, maybe it's just not that productive for whatever the use is, and people are scraping by trying to produce enough hay or trying to grow enough grass for the cows, and it's just not working out. You know, sometimes we have storms, we have droughts, we have all these different things that are causing difficulty for people. And essentially, this has just created a wildlife management valuation has created another option for landowners to use. So before you begin, just kind of go through some things to think about, some things you might want to do. Talking to a biologist is a very good idea. This can do several things, one of which would be avoid unnecessary or even potentially harmful actions. You know, you may think, well, I want to do this and I'm going to go in and I'm going to conduct this activity. Well, it may be worthwhile talking to someone before you do, because it could be harmful or unnecessary. You could either waste time, money, resources, or actually have a negative impact going against something that you're wanting to promote. Another thing that this is helpful is it can help to develop a plan with feasible activities. You know, you want whatever the activities that you're going to commit to, you want them to be reasonable. You want them to be achievable. You know, you don't necessarily want to set such lofty goals that they're not achievable and that it's only a frustration. Another benefit of talking to biologists is that they can often provide detailed habitat and soil descriptions. I mean, we're all familiar with what that means, but really getting down to setting the stage for what the expectation is. You know, what are the limitations by the habitat type? What about the soils? What do we expect responses would be in these soil types? And most of your plant communities are very, very closely related to very specific soil characteristics. And so that's kind of what drives the train, so to speak, of wildlife management, is the soils. And it also allows you the opportunity to ask questions, you know, whether you're doing this just as something you want to do, whether you're doing it maybe even as a wildlife management tax valuation. There may be some specific questions or concerns that you have. And it's always a good idea before you start something to have a good understanding of what you're about to get yourself into. So that's some of the benefits, I think, of speaking or visiting with a biologist before you dive in. Another thing you'll want to do is kind of evaluate your commitment. You know, what that means to me, I guess, is that you're looking at all these different factors that are going to impact your ability and your level of commitment. You know, are you going to be living on the property? Well, if you live there, it changes the different things that you're able to do. It's not as difficult. You know, if you travel, if you're an absentee landowner, that may change the specific activities and the timing and the amount of effort that you can put in, or the time that you have to devote to this cause. You know, also time, money, and equipment needs. Those are all things that are pretty important to consider moving forward. There are a lot of flexible options within this wildlife management, and you can really make it fairly simple. You can make it pretty cost effective. You could spend as much time or money as you wanted to. And so there's just a lot of things to think about before you move forward. And then I guess the last one ultimately would be if you'll be conducting the activities, if you're hiring a third party to do it. A lot of times, depending on who's conducting the activities, it'll determine which activities are most suitable. You know, if you're going to put up a bird feeder, but you're only going to be there a handful of times throughout the year, well, you're going to want a large bird feeder, or you're going to want to hire someone to go fill it and make sure that it's maintained and kept full. That's just one example. So we've kind of talked through some of these things. You know, where do we begin? How do we get started? Small acreage is a term, you know, I've got it highlighted there. It's very relative. It can be relative to your location, to your habitat type. Texas is a huge, diverse state. a lot of different habitat types. If you said small acreage in West Texas, that means something very different than if you said small acreage in parts of Eastern Texas or even the hill country. A lot of times the smaller acreage properties there. So that is a relative term. And then it also relates back to the surrounding area, your specific location, your habitats. I see places all the time where this may be a sea of woodland surrounded by grasslands or hay pastures or hay meadows. And this is really, this one little property has an even higher value because it's the only wooded area around. And that kind of can be equated out, whether it's grasslands, woods, it could be waterways or riparian zones. So it's very important to think about how your property relates to the larger scale of properties around there as well. Once again, we want to analyze this property is one of the first steps. You want to identify plants. Plant identification is important. That's one of the things I've learned through my formal education. I was always interested in the animals, but I've learned the further I go down this path, how important the plants are to all the different animals. And that's one thing that is important is understanding, because they'll tell you a lot. They tell you not only a lot about the habitats, the condition of the habitat, they can tell you a lot about the animals that are using the habitat as well. If you know how to read those signs, it can give you a much broader understanding. And in general, habitat types, that there are differences in understanding what makes them different and why they're different, what is achievable, what's important. Maybe some of these habitats are very sensitive, understanding the impacts and the differences that you can make. Soil types, as mentioned already, the potential productivity, how a lot of these climax plant communities are really specifically tied to the soils. Another thing these soils tell a lot of folks is an example of watch out for this specific plant, whether it's mesquite, huisac, one of these that aggressively invades certain specific soil types. They know, okay, well, this part of my property has this specific soil type and mesquite aggressively invades this soil type. So to be on the lookout for it, because most of these problematic plants usually are much, much easier to control as they're developing. It's that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure kind of deal. So if you catch it early, it's a lot easier to deal with. And if you let them become really established, then you have to figure out how you can control these huge plants that could have been controlled at an earlier stage. And then last, I think one of the really important things to know about the property is the current or historic usages of the property. They have real implications on moving forward, management decisions, limitations on what you can achieve. If that property had just been used for grazing, on the surface, well, then there's probably not that much impact to the seed bank and seed bank viability. Had it been used for row crops, that's a totally different story. You may have exhausted all the native seed bank in the upper 18 inches because it's been plowed over every other year for forever. So just knowing that historic use is important, and knowing how that impacts the current state of the property. Those things change. You remove cattle, you change numbers, you remove pressure, even not even fully remove cattle, but just maybe change the numbers or change the way that you're implementing. You start a rotational grazing regime. It can really change and impact those plant communities in positive ways a lot of times. We talked about the general habitat types, and these are very general. This is the 40,000 foot view. Grasslands, generally indicated by herbaceous growth, limited structural components. Maybe you have a little bit of brush, maybe the structure of the grasses are providing cover, not necessarily canopy. Trees are generally not associated with these grasslands very much. Totally different set of activities, different animals. Look at the grasslands versus the woodlands. Well, the woodlands have a propensity to be overly thick in the understory, so you might be looking at the grasslands, you're trying to provide additional cover by strip mowing or deferred mowing or brush piles, where in the woodlands, you're trying to conduct brush control because it's too thick, so there are several different considerations on the type of habitat and specifically the activities and how they relate to those habitat types. Savannas and shrublands are generally pretty productive because it's usually a mix, of open and wooded areas. Sometimes you get some brush species that are problematic in these kind of savannas and shrublands. And over time, generally, in the absence of any natural disturbance or even any kind of disturbance in general, you have a natural progression where these grasslands, and you guys have probably seen it, they want to go from open grasslands. Well, you pull the cows off, next thing you know, you've got brush and shrubs, and then all of a sudden it's turning woody. So that's kind of the natural progression of the land. And then riparian zones, and riparian is a fancy word basically for water. So anything related to water, stream banks, even seasonal wetland, seasonal drainages or draws that have water usually have more sensitive habitat types. They're more prone to certain problems like erosion and things like that. Also different plant communities. And so there may be different things that you can do in those habitat types. So where should you begin? We want to develop a target species. I put a pretty extreme example over here of a dodo bird. Well, you need to have something with a sustainable population size. It needs to be something that's probably already existing there. It needs to be feasible, economically and biologically. I don't care how much money or effort you are willing to put into this, you're not going to bring the dodo bird back. A more realistic example would be in some areas of East Texas, it's turkeys. They've just been absent from there. Many issues relate to it, but one specific habitat manager on a small acreage is probably not going to have an impact. Some areas, they may on things like quail, where there's still a fair number of pockets of quail throughout. And if you get a suitable habitat on your property, you may be able to draw some in. So mainly the main thing to think about when you're developing these species is that it's something that you can actually have there and something that you can do there. Generally, we also want it to be directly impacted and measurable, So for instance, this example in that top picture shows one of our products. It actually covers 2 wildlife management activities. It provides supplemental water and food. That's going to directly impact certain animals. That's going to directly impact doves, small mammals, quail, rabbits, even maybe squirrels, things like that are going to have access to that. Those are the species, the target species that you are going to want to manage for. There are some activities that directly or maybe even indirectly impact a lot of animals. Some of your habitat related, brush control, for instance. Well, that one may impact a lot of animals in a positive way. Whereas deer feed, or supplemental mineral for deer might only impact them, or something to that effect. So sometimes there are a suite of animals that benefit. It's not just directly related to one. And then most importantly, I think, is to choose something that's important to you. You want it to be sustainable. You want it to be on your property. You want it to be there. But you also want it to be something that you're passionate about, because if you're passionate about it, you're going to measure it, you're going to look at it, you're going to observe it. It's going to be something that there's more buy-in, So, here we go. What are common? Well, most common would be game species, deer, quail, turkey, doves. Not target species are going to be feral hogs and anything exotic. And so they do require that the species that you manage for are native animals that are naturally occurring indigenous to Texas. And so feral hogs don't fall into that category. They are actually non-native, very destructive. There's a lot of direct and indirect impacts they have on a lot of your native species, direct competition, habitat destruction, even predatory action on a lot of species and things. And then the exotic species, axis fallow, those are things that people sometimes think, oh, well, that's wildlife management, but because they're not native, they don't technically qualify. So there's no specific prohibition against having some, but in general, if you're doing things that are going to benefit the native animals, you would generally make choices that are not going to benefit those exotic species. And so there may be at some point some pretty tough decisions on, well, what is the carrying capacity of this land? What do we need to do? Do we need to remove some of these exotic species? I know that's a pretty common thing with wildlife management, is because you're focusing on native, some of those exotics need to go away. And then several options for some of these smaller properties, songbirds, owls, doves, waterfowl. It can be pollinators, small mammals, reptiles, amphibians. Some of the area in the Bastrop area, you have a lot of folks that are interested in the Houston toad. We have a lady who really likes box turtles, so it doesn't necessarily have to only be a set of animals that are game species or something like that. You can manage essentially for anything. One of the ones people love are bats. Bats are really, really popular because they eat a lot of mosquitoes. And so a lot of folks want to promote bats. Woodpeckers are popular, you know, and there are certain different activities that you can do that are going to benefit them as well. So this kind of brings us to the management activities. And in an effort to express it, we're just going to kind of go through and explain kind of how it all fits together here. Basically, this 1D1 wildlife management tax valuation figures that any, and I think the accepted list is maybe 58 or 60 different specific activities. They all fall under one of 7 overarching categories, and those categories are listed here. I just like this quote from Aldo Leopold. It says that land can be restored by the creative use of the same tools which have heretofore destroyed it: axe, cow, plow, fire, and gun. And if you don't know, Aldo Leopold was kind of the father of what used to be several years ago deemed game management, now considered more wildlife management. And that's true. You know, the things that have destroyed, the toolbox is the same, whether you're destroying habitat or you're helping promote it or making it better. You know, the axe, cow, the plow, fire, and the gun. So that's the tools that we have to work with to achieve any of these objectives. So the list is habitat control, erosion control, predator control, supplemental food, supplemental water, supplemental shelter, and census. And you'll notice I had food, water, and shelter underlined there. Those are generally the 3 basic building blocks of life. You know, I mean, it could be argued for wildlife, they need space, but those are the 3 that we're going to dive a little deeper into, particularly, and talk about next, just because of their extreme importance. Some of the considerations, you know, as far as managing and manipulating plants, essentially, is all you're doing to create diversity. There's a big buzzword. We all hear it, somewhat obscure. Well, what does it mean, diversity? Well, there's several ways you can look at it. It doesn't only mean different types of plants. It can be different structure as well. So structure and composition. And this is a great example here, these 3 photographs in a progression. You're looking at 3 different growing seasons. The first in the line would be let's say that's the first year after you remove or reduce grazing pressure on your property. You say, okay, you know, I got a pretty good bit of grass growing. Well, year 2, wow, okay, I'm starting to get even taller grass, maybe a few different species, a little bit more structural diversity. You know, the grass is a little bit taller, and maybe even the composition changes a little bit. You start seeing some other species come in. And then if you look at the last one, where you start having some of these wildflowers and some of these forbs, I don't think any one of us could look at these 3 pictures and not determine very easily which one would be the most beneficial for wildlife. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to look, you know. Other consideration could be that you need to manage the mouths on your property. And when I say the mouths, those are the grazers. Those are the things that are large enough and active enough to where they can actually have an impact on the habitat value for other animals. You want to manage pests. You know, generally it can be called predator control is one of the activity categories, but it can be more than just predators. You know, there are several other things that can cause problems. We just call it pests as a general term. And then you want to measure the results, and that generally falls under census activities. So talked about taking the deep dive here into food, water, and shelter. Food is one that there are several different ways to achieve these objectives. One very popular way would be to use feeders to provide supplemental food. You know, these feeders don't necessarily have to be big 1,000-pound deer feeders. They could be bird feeders. Scratch grains in bird feeders provide a lot of benefit to a lot of different birds. One of the important things to include is, particularly in the wintertime, would be black oil sunflower seed. Black oil sunflowers have high protein. They have a lot of fats in them, which are helpful to the birds, particularly in the wintertime. And so we have some recommendations. You know, any kind of mix that you would put in there, you want to have a high proportion, maybe up 25% or somewhere thereabouts of black oil sunflowers. And the sunflowers will draw different birds as well as the grains. Nectar, you know, it could be for hummingbirds, which in some areas are year-round residents. Sometimes they're moving through, but that's a real benefit as a supplemental food. It doesn't just have to be confined to what we're thinking of as feeders. It could be mineral supplementation. Minerals are often used for deer, but they can be used for small mammals and several areas of the state, particularly deep sandy or well-drained soils. coarse soils, they have certain minerals that are lacking. And no matter what you provide as far as a food, you may not be providing those minerals. Similar to our diet, a lot of these animals have very specific requirements, and they need some of these specialized minerals that may be lacking from certain areas. It's not just using feeders. It could be managing the existing plants, so looking at activities like coming in and disking, maybe it's lightly disking the top, and you promote some of these early successional plants like that everybody loves is goat weed or something like that, where you're providing food resources for the animals. Could be mowing, timed mowing, different mowing, deferred mowing, strip mowing, all of different implementation ways of mowing on the landscape can provide a bunch of different benefits to the plant life. And it can bring old plants, new growth is usually a good thing. Even if you mow over some of these woody plants, sometimes the fresh new growth as they resprout is food for an animal, whereas after 2 or 3 years, it may not be a food source, particularly for deer and things like that, because it gets too rank and too hard for them to eat, or it becomes inaccessible as it grows. Another really great management tool is prescribed fire. It just has a tremendous number of benefits, particularly for plants. Certain plants will not come hardly in the absence of fire, or they'll disappear in the absence of fire sometimes from the landscape. I've noticed with the plants, particularly this year with the hard freezes that we had, I've seen some pretty interesting plants, I think, that are in a response to that disturbance. So if you think about it, it makes sense. This system is always in some state of flux. You've got these natural disturbances. And so wildlife management essentially is controlling whatever that level of disturbance is, but trying to mimic natural processes and do it in a way that you get a productive response. It can also be growing food, which a lot of times is much preferred. We go to these feeders. Feeders sometimes are artificial. That may create a situation. Sometimes they transmit diseases, particularly among animals and birds. And I read about it all the time. Different animals having problems because they congregate at the feeder. Well, that goes away when you're able to plant the food source. It could be native plant reseeding. It could be overseeding winter wheat, or maybe ryegrass or clover or something, cool season cover crop type plantings. It could be food plots, and a reminder that food plots are not just for deer. Some of them are bird centric. Some of them are pollinator mixes. So you can plant all these different things that are going to promote wildlife, but it doesn't just have to be things with fur and feathers, because all of those animals and all of those insects play a huge role in helping to develop and improve habitat value. So that brings us to water. And for water, there are essentially two types of water. One would be natural sources. Natural sources are ponds, streams, tanks. We call them ponds in East Texas, but they're called tanks in a lot of areas. Lakes, wet weather creeks. Some of these ephemeral, maybe you have these oxbows that only fill up with water during a flood or when it rains, but they hold water for a period of time throughout the year, and those have a real benefit. As far as activities and wildlife management activities, in order to qualify, kind of as we talked about that effort-based, it's conservation, not preservation. So existing water sources do not necessarily easily lend themselves to qualifying for wildlife management because you're not doing anything, they're already there. So in order for them to qualify, you need to do things. Maybe it's a repair, maybe it's enlarging an existing pond or tank, maybe you're repairing a dam, maybe you're providing more water than what was there, you're helping drainage or dealing with erosion. Those are all ways that you can take these existing water sources and improve them and count that as part of your wildlife management activities. Supplemental sources are the number 2 source of water, aside from natural. And these are generally water that you're adding that wasn't already there. So there are several ways that you can do that. Water that doesn't naturally occur on the landscape. It could be a trough. Maybe you've got an old livestock, a cattle trough. Well, by modifying it very simply by putting a ramp for access, and a ramp on one side to the lip and from the inside to the lip so animals can access it or can escape from it, you've created a wildlife friendly water source out of an old existing trough that was plumbed in there. It could be a trough or a windmill overflow. All of a sudden you've got that windmill pumping water to a pila or something like that, where you've got water that's available. And so you create additional water resources for the animals. It can also be guzzlers and water tables, rainwater collection tables. This example on the bottom, this picture is one of our products here. The rainwater collection table, it's a kind of a passive system, you know, so it's gravity flow. The rainwater collects on the roof. It goes to the gutter, which feeds into the 100-gallon or 300-gallon tank. Gravity flows to this float, this pan with the float valve. And so you essentially collect the water when it comes, but you even redistribute it throughout the year. So this really helps to supplement water during dry periods. There's several different options here. I've seen people make them themselves. Sometimes you see folks with the gutter system from a big barn, or maybe it's coming off of their house and they pipe that water to a tank or bring it to a little spot where the wildlife can access it. And so you're providing another additional year-round source of water, which in many, many areas, and just depending on the weather, that is a tremendous benefit for a lot of wildlife. Shelter. So shelter, we think about nest boxes, nesting boxes for songbirds. So maybe it's eastern bluebirds, maybe it's wrens or titmouse, Carolina chickadee, you know, all these different songbirds that will use these nesting boxes. But it doesn't just have to be songbirds. It could be owls, it could be ducks. Each one of these different suites of animals has its own requirement, you know, and honestly, the songbirds, the requirement changes based on your ecoregion or where you're located, you know. So if you're along the coast, then they would say they want one songbird box for every 5 acres. If you're inland a little ways in East Texas, it'd be one for 3 acres. But if you start getting a little bit further west, it might be one for 5 acres. And so there are very specific requirements on some of these activities. The songbirds, I think, say, most of them say they want to have a minimum of 6 and a maximum of 40. And then they have a based on acres. Well, the owls is different. You know, that one may be one for every 10 acres. The duck boxes are usually one for every 10 acres of suitable habitat. So a suitable habitat for a duck usually includes water, right? So there are some ways that they're different depending on what you want to do. There are different ways to implement it. It's not just nesting boxes for avian species. It could be bat houses. Bats are really, really popular, and putting up bat houses, there's specific requirements on acreage depending on where you are with that. It can be brush piles. This picture here of a large brush pile. Those are going to benefit a lot of animals. You know, people think about, well, the woods are great and the woods are wonderful, but the woods, even thick woods, may not provide the kind of cover that a rabbit needs, for instance. Brush piles could be providing cover for wildlife that we may not necessarily want. You know, it could be some of those reptiles and amphibians and particularly snakes or rats or something like that too, you know. So you just kind of think about implementation, and it just kind of depends. If you're in the woods, the brush pile may not be the first choice, but in a very open area, it could probably provide a real benefit to a lot of wildlife species. And there's a lot of birds and things that use brush piles as well. Strip mowing is one that we kind of mentioned, primarily in grassland open habitats that want to stay grasslands. Well, you want periodically to mow them, but you may not want to mow everything all at once every year. You may want to defer mowing till after the growing season when everything's seeded out. You may want to administer some sort of a rotational mowing scheme where you mow a third of the open areas in one year, and then the next year you mow some that you didn't, so that over the period of 3 years, all of the open grassy areas get mowed, which means they're not going to grow up in brush, but it also provides 3 different growth levels of or different structures of habitat. Because some of these animals, you know, 6-inch grass versus 12-inch grass versus 24-inch grass may not be a big deal to us, but to some of these animals, that is a big deal. And those are 3 very different types of cover. Snag management, and snag, I have it in air quotes. Snag management is essentially, snag is just a fancy word for a standing dead tree. Everywhere I've been in Texas since 2011 has plenty of snags. You know, there is a mathematical way to figure out how many snags you need to retain. Snags have a benefit. They have a benefit. Standing dead trees have a huge benefit for wildlife. You know, it can be woodpeckers, it could be owls, it could be other raptors that use them to hunt from, but it can also be secondary cavity nesting species. You know, maybe some of these cavity nesting songbirds will come in after the woodpeckers peck giant holes and nest in it for a year or 2. Well, then you have other species that may come in. So snags are another thing that provide a lot of shelter. So it brings us to wildlife management, which essentially is plant management. Diversity, we talked about diversity already. Diversity is key. Brush management is manipulating the structure and diversity of the brush. Sometimes leaving some is hard. A lot of this involves kind of shifting how you view the land and how you want to treat the land. If you've been producing cattle or if you've been cutting hay, you're going to have to kind of change the way that you view the land. Brush is not necessarily all terrible. So you manage it and you may maintain some, things like quail really like brush. It could be shallow disking to increase plant diversity. As I mentioned, weeds and bugs aren't all bad. If you are, as far as the weeds, the goat weeds, everybody hates them who are cattle people, but if you're a mourning dove, a goat weed's a pretty great food. And then if you're a quail or a turkey, that grasshopper looks like a T-bone steak, so some of these things that we have done over time and these attitudes that we've developed, this kind of needs to shift and change in the way that we're looking at what we're doing. Timing matters when you're talking about plants. And so any of these activities, particularly in controlling plants, a lot of times it has a lot to do with the specific physiology of the plant. We're looking at prickly pear. At certain times of the year, if it's too dry, you can spray all you want. It's not going to kill it because it's too dry. It's not active. The one I'm thinking about in East Texas would be yaupon. Very specific timing on yaupon in the early growing season when it's growing. It has more to do with the internal physiology of the plant. Chinese tallow, you want to control it in the fall because it's taking up all the resources right before it goes dormant. And that's the time when you can effectively kill it. So timing really matters when you're talking about managing these species. Then we talked and hit on burning earlier. It's great. It's a wonderful tool. It is very challenging, logistically very challenging, very difficult to implement. The main point here is that if you're interested and inclined, you can get help. There are a lot of opportunities from Parks and Wildlife, prescribed fire associations. There are a lot of interest and a lot of availability of assistance as far as conducting prescribed burns. So now we come to the controlling the mouths. We talked quite a bit about it earlier where you're controlling browsers. These animals have the ability to impact the habitat. White-tailed deer, so controlling the deer population can be part of your wildlife management plan. That in and of itself is an activity that would fall under habitat control by controlling the deer population. But that also extends to exotic species, so you want to maintain, as we mentioned earlier, lower levels of those exotics because of maybe not direct competition, maybe it's a grazer, not a browser, but they do have an impact on the habitat for all the animals that are native. It can also be grazing management. A lot of wildlife managers will say that cattle are essentially a walking shredder and a disc. They are good for property. They're good for wildlife. The problem lies in how we implement grazing. So most of our native plants and our systems are even very well adapted to high intensity, low frequency grazing. The bison would come through, they would mow everything down. The plants would have several months or a year to recover. What the problem with grazing in the way that we implement it is that we put up fences and we continuously graze, which has an impact on the plant communities. So one of the important things there is that you develop a plan. Generally, they want to see that you have a rotational grazing plan or that you defer grazing throughout a portion of the year. Essentially, there are ways that you can include grazing as a wildlife management activity if you have a little bit of a plan written up and that you implement it, not necessarily continuously, that you're rotational with your program. And then another thing that's important is working a lot of times with a co-op, so maybe your property is small and you don't own cattle, but your neighbor does, and you can come into some kind of agreement where you allow him to use your property for grazing. That works really well as spillover, as part of a larger operation, and kind of talking along the lines of that co-op. That kind of brings us to the next big point, is if you need help, there are wildlife management associations. You can join these co-ops or start these co-ops. Essentially what that is and this is boiled way down, several tracts with common goals. So you would have several adjacent tracts of land that gives you a larger area on which you can make management decisions and have bigger impacts. It can be a few or it could be several different properties. Essentially, this helps to reduce the fragmentation that we touched on earlier, ownership versus habitat. Well, the ownership fragmentation is happening, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to experience the same level of habitat fragmentation. So these co-ops help curb that impact because you can cooperatively manage much larger areas when you have common management goals. Other thing it does is it pools knowledge and resources. And so, as I just mentioned, with the cattle, maybe you don't own cattle, but your neighbor does. Well, you can do those sort of cooperative efforts where you can have a positive impact. Maybe it's equipment, maybe you don't have a tractor or a backhoe or bulldozer or whatever you may be needing. Well, maybe someone in that group does, or it could be personnel. Let's try to implement this prescribed burn. Well, you're going to need a lot of people, maybe more than you have available in your immediate friends and family. And so reaching out and getting involved with these larger groups, you can have get a lot more accomplished sometimes. I know in the 90s, Texas Parks and Wildlife developed a ton of these different co-ops, some of which are still really active. Also, a lot of your counties will have wildlife management groups that are helpful. Maybe it's just information, maybe it's just sharing information or resources, but there are a lot of ways that you can get assistance outside of your normal circle. We talked about pigs and pests. It doesn't necessarily just mean pigs or feral hogs and fire ants. Those aren't the only two things. Sometimes it can be nest parasites. You're looking at cowbirds. Predator baffles are really, really popular. They're the inverted cone of shame that keeps everything from getting in your nest boxes. I was with a guy recently. He put Vaseline on the poles so that the animals couldn't get to the nest boxes. They make some commercially available products. One is called Tanglefoot. It's sticky. It keeps the critters from getting up into that nest box and predating that nest. It can also be controlling predators, as we mentioned. We got this picture of the hogs. It could be coyotes, raccoons. Several of these species, particularly coyotes and raccoons, there's not a lot of trapping going on for furs. That trait has kind of disappeared over time. Also, a lot of the high-level, top-level predators have pretty much been removed. And so you've got these populations, and anyone who has been around or ever had a deer feeder understands the impact that has on raccoons. They will raise a family on a deer feeder. And so controlling those guys kind of can help. When those populations get out of control, they have a negative impact on others. Obviously, we talk about fire ants. Very, very detrimental. The requirement on fire ants has a minimum intensity. They say you have to do a minimum of 10 acres or 10% of the total land area, whichever is greater. So some of these, as I mentioned earlier, have very specific requirements. Some don't, but it's not necessarily just a list of these things that hurt animals. It could be some non-native plants that have deleterious impacts as well. Chinese tallow, some of these plants that are just real problematic. And so controlling those is also a wildlife management activity. So that brings us kind of to the conclusion, more or less. We're talking about measuring success. A good plan needs to be adaptive. Census is a way that you measure. It could be monitoring of non-game. It could be a wildlife diary. Periodically, you make entries. It could be wildlife photo stations or camera stations. Incidental observations. It could be like these folks over here who are doing a spring breeding bird count or a Christmas bird count. Any type of measuring that you're doing is great and generally well received from the appraisers. Could be this camera up here where these deer are eating on that. A lot of camera census now for deer in particular. They've kind of gone away from a lot of your traditional spotlight counts. But the main point there is that you want to be consistent with your measurement techniques, and so that you can compare those metrics over time. If it's apples to apples kind of comparison. If you measure the same thing, you can compare it over time and you can gain information from that. And then in conclusion, these are just kind of the main take-home points. First, fragmentation is increasing. That's happening. It's smaller, more expensive properties. We are losing open space lands. There's not much we can do about that. But the flip side of that coin is that private landowners now more than ever are essential to conservation and to wildlife management, particularly in Texas. I mentioned, 95 to 97% privately owned our state. And so private land is super important. Understanding your land is going to be a key to any of your management successes, is understanding what you can do, what you can't do, having realistic expectations, developing a plan with achievable goals. Nothing will frustrate you more than setting goals that are far too lofty to achieve. And so, setting those goals that you can meet over time, improving. And then the last point being that just working with neighboring properties can not only benefit your wildlife, but it can benefit the successes, a little bit larger scale. You can get in these cooperative efforts and really make an impact where you think, oh, well, just I hear it all the time, well, my 50 acres or my 100 acres. But when you look at it as several hundred acres between several adjacent landowners, it becomes much larger. You can have much more of a positive impact. Just want to mention, our family of companies. Obviously, I work with Plateau Land and Wildlife. Braun and Gresham, the attorneys at law, they primarily work with landowner rights in the state of Texas. That's their primary focus. Plateau Land Group is mostly, they deal with real estate transactions, but they generally are working as someone who's going to get you in touch. If you're looking for land in a certain spot, they're going to get you in touch with the right people who can find you that land. And so it's almost a consulting type deal. And then 1031 exchange, if you know anything about 1031 exchanges, you probably know more about than I do. But essentially, it's a way that you can transition from one property. You have a short time where you can exchange for another property without having to take on a huge tax burden that otherwise may be there. So there's a process, and that company deals specifically with those 1031 exchanges. I want to thank you guys. Less work, more enjoyment. Our sales folks a lot of times will say that if you're doing wildlife management and it's as much work as what you were doing before, then you're probably not doing it correctly. There is work involved, but it's usually much more enjoyable work.
Awesome. Thanks, Tucker. And we can dive into some questions now. So I want to remind anybody, if you may have joined a little bit later, you can submit that through our Q&A box on Zoom. So just scroll over your Zoom screen. There'll be a toolbar that pops up at the top or the bottom. And on that toolbar is an option for Q&A. If you click that, it will actually open up a separate pop-up box and you can type those directly in. So we'll kick it off with our first one here. How do you figure out a species in your area?
A species to manage for?
I think that's, yeah.
One of the things that's there are several common species. Some of that has to do with the specific habitat on your property. And so figuring that out may be something that you could visit with someone, if it's something that you can determine. Certain songbirds are very common throughout certain areas. So sometimes that's part of the hard part. And sometimes that whole process for me works backwards. So sometimes I look at the activities that you're inclined to do and the things you're going to do. And then I say, okay, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, that's going to benefit this, this, and that. So sometimes developing that list of specific species may be difficult. And they say, honestly, on that paperwork, they require that you have specific species. Well, I'm going to tell you songbirds is one of those categories. So that's a pretty vague group. It may not necessarily be dialed right into cardinals or eastern bluebird. It may be songbirds as more of a guild or a general group of species that you're managing to impact.
Why is erosion control important?
Erosion control is very important because once erosion has started, it doesn't stop itself. And that's how you lose topsoil. That's how you lose a lot of plants. The creation of the ground, and I guess it kind of falls into me as part of why the land is always growing in value, because they're not making any more of it. At least if you're not in a volcanic area, there's only a certain amount of land. And when it erodes and goes away and washes out, it doesn't rebuild itself. And so controlling erosion is very, very important. Mainly, I see it a lot. I see erosion occurring naturally on rivers and things. I see it all over the landscape, and I always think, man, just making some effort, something to kind of slow it down usually will help quite a bit. But one of the reasons it's very important is because it does not check itself. It never stops. It only generally continues and gets worse as you go along.
What about when your pond turns into a swamp? What is the best way to control algae growth in plants that don't hurt the water table as well as the animals using the pond for water?
One of the things with ponds is just like several other things, ponds have a lifespan, and a life expectancy. And you see it even naturally in beaver ponds and things like that. And so if a pond has been around for a long, long time, it starts to naturally, a lot of these plants will grow and they fall into the pond. Well, they don't necessarily deteriorate in the absence of oxygen. And so you end up with kind of this sludge, and then you start growing other plants and things. And over time, the pond becomes less and less productive. It starts growing algae. The the water, the dissolved oxygen can be low. One of the best things to do for a pond is to either drain it out, to dredge it out, dredge out some of that old dead organic material. Maybe pump the water out, let it dry and consolidate. As far as algae control, I'm not specific. I think there are probably some chemicals you can use. One of the things that's helpful to any pond, as far as I understand, is adding that dissolved oxygen, whether it's water flowing in, it could be some sort of a fountain, it could be some sort of a bubbling bubbler that goes out in the middle and provides oxygen to the water. So there are a lot of different things that you can do. And all of which those activities are included under the general category of erosion control. And I failed to mention it earlier, but anything generally water related, whether it be erosion control or supplemental water, on a wildlife management perspective from this use, you can use it as a 10-year activity. So let's say, because they're very expensive, you either create a new tank or a pond, or maybe you enlarge a pond. Well, let's say you did it this year. Well, you could count it every year, even though you conducted it in this year, you could count it for 10 years as part of your wildlife management activities that help you to qualify. So although they're much more labor intense and generally very expensive, they give you, I like to say, it gives you a little more mileage on that activity as far as the credit that you get for it.
Kind of a follow-up to this question, Tucker. Do adding fish to ponds help with that at all?
Yeah, fish generally, a healthy pond can support a number of fish. One of the things depends on the type of fish, depends on the pond itself. And so, having healthy plants, you had mentioned the plants a little bit, having a healthy amount of plants in the pond is helpful. Catfish sometimes, and even ponds that are for cattle, watering ponds for cattle, a lot of times will get really murky. Catfish tend to have that ability to muddy up ponds. And then certain areas, just based on the soil characteristics and what's feeding into the pond, sometimes you get a very murky water. And that murky water sometimes makes it hard for plants and even a lot of the fish to survive. So pond health and pond management is honestly a science in and of itself. There are some very general things that I could probably help you with, but some of this is just related maybe to age, maybe the fact that it's gotten too old and it's set too long, and it's at a stage to where it's not as productive as if you make some sort of an impact. Cleaning it out usually is helpful. Establishing healthy populations of fish, although that's one of the things I don't really like, is that there's no way to include the fisheries management into wildlife. Although there's a real benefit ecologically, a benefit to a lot of wildlife species, fisheries management is just kind of one of those things that it doesn't get included in your wildlife management plan as an activity, or at least not as a qualifying activity. I would argue that people who manage ponds to maintain the health of the pond really do benefit a lot of native wildlife that are there. One of the things you can do is maintain the water level. That's helpful. And most folks who want to maintain or keep fish in their pond, they do maintain that water level, or at least have the ability to pump water where they can provide enough water for those fish to survive and to be healthy.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I currently have 30 continuous acres with wildlife exemption out of 90 total acres. Does the exemption require continuous acres, or can I have a few acres on the other side of the property as well?
As long as you own the entire property, and it can be even several tracts, several different property IDs, they don't have to be touching to each other as long as you own the entire tract. And what a lot of folks will do, a good example in my mind is some properties that you see it now, these appraisal districts are getting a little more particular with their details. And so maybe you had 100 acres and it was all hay production since as long as you can remember. Well, all of a sudden you've got one little wooded creek that runs through the center, and they say, wait a minute, you got 11 acres of this little creek bed that aren't producing hay. What are you going to do with it? There's no hay growing in there because it's trees. And so then you say, well, I want to put that in wildlife management. You can set up these split uses. Because wildlife management valuation falls under the agricultural umbrella, you can determine, okay, I want this piece. A recent property I worked on, they had, I'm just going to say they had a part of it in wildlife management, they had a portion of it in hay production, and they had a portion of it in cattle grazing. So they had 3 different particular uses on that one piece of property. As long as you tell them and you explain what's going on and where it's going on, usually it's something that you can do.
What is the best way to attract bats? We had a box for a couple of years and no inhabitants.
You know, I see a lot of bat boxes that don't get a lot of use. I was talking to a gentleman today about bat boxes, and he said that he's same situation. He said, "Man, I've had it up for a couple of years," but he was still holding on to hope. He said that he had been told by someone that sometimes it could take several years for the bats to find it. One of the biggest draws and one of the most important things I think about for bats is that you have a source of water close by. They generally like being close to water, whether that be a tank or a pond or maybe even a creek or some kind of wetland marsh area. Bats usually nest close to water. But yeah, I would say even a couple of years may not be long enough for the bats, you know. And then honestly, some of this it's hard to draw them in, you know, so you can lead a horse right up to the water, but you may not be able to make it drink. And some of these wildlife activities are like that, you know, so you put out nesting boxes for bluebirds or bats or whatever you do, wherever you do it, you try to focus on the things that you can control. Okay, I'm going to put it in the right habitat. But even if you do everything correctly, they still may not use it. So that is a little bit unfortunate. But I would say to try to hang on a little longer because it could take several years sometimes for them to find it and use it.
Could you discuss the spotlight procedures for deer surveys, like how to route, how far do you count right or left of the route, and how long that route would be required if it was a 300-acre property?
Okay. As far as the specifics, you know, you would generally look and they want to see a route that incorporates at least representative different habitat types throughout the property. So the distance could be highly variable on what that route line distance is. You want to try to survey most of the property. When you're doing it, you can look, generally, you try to look out at both sides of you know, the left and the right. And periodically, you want to measure distances that you can see. So one of the assumptions is that you want to at least have accurate estimates of how much land you're able to look at. You know, so if you're driving down this road or trail and you can only see 10 yards, well, there's a lot that you're not seeing. And so essentially what you're doing is you're measuring every once in a while and you're getting an idea. And then you take that little piece that you've looked at and you take those numbers of deer that you saw and you just kind of expand them out. Well, one of the problems is the difficulty of spotlights. They're fun to do because you get to see the animals, but they don't tell you a lot of really good information because there's a lot that you're not able to look at. And then they assume that these animals are evenly distributed. And most folks that have been around at all and have seen these animals, you know, if you've ever done a drive at night, there are going to be areas where they're not animals at all. There are going to be areas where there are lots of animals. Deer in particular kind of tend to congregate through a lot of the year in family groups and things like that. So one of the ways that they're kind of moving toward on these counts is remote camera counts. And so there's a certain protocol for these camera counts, and you'd set out a camera. It would be after the bucks had their hardened antlers. You know, so you'd be looking at September and that time of the year for a couple of weeks, and you set out bait and you set out cameras, and then you get those 2 weeks worth of pictures, and you would have literally, you probably have thousands of pictures over 2 weeks of deer. Well, you could, at that time, you could kind of figure out how many individual bucks you've seen based on their antlers, based on the characteristics. Okay, you know, so then you take that individual number of bucks and you look at the total number of bucks. Okay, so if you had 10 individual bucks and you had 1,000 pictures of bucks and you had 3,000 pictures of does, you kind of go backwards and say, well, I probably have about 3 does to every buck. And so those sex ratios, the buck-doe ratio is very, very important in the deer. And so it can tell you more because it has implications of breeding, chronology. If there's not a lot of competition for breeding, sometimes you get inferior genetics that get passed along. So just the structure of how that breeding works, those sex ratios are important that they stay within certain parameters. When they get way out of whack, you start seeing really strange things manifest. So I could probably find, if you want to reach out, I could probably give you something in written, maybe a little more standard as far as spotlight counts or even remote camera counts. But that's kind of a general, just some general guidelines on how they're conducted.
Thanks, Tucker. And again, I'll remind everybody, I will send out a follow-up email tomorrow, and it will have our contact information. So you can either grab contact information right from here and reach out, or just follow up to that email tomorrow if you have more questions. If a tree falls, can you leave it, and does it count as an activity?
Generally, that snag retention is generally refers to trees that are standing. What I would say is you could use it to create a brush pile, or use it maybe even as the basis for the starting of a brush pile. Dead and down wood do have a real benefit. It doesn't necessarily have to be some artificial brush pile. It can be a naturally occurring tree that's fallen, and you've just kind of enhanced it by creating more cover. But yeah, there are ways to include that. Some of those are a little more specific on the details of how you would actually implement it. So just saying across the board, oh, as long as the tree falls, you're good. I don't know if I'd say that, but I'd say definitely under certain circumstances, you can maybe cut it up and pile it. And, there may be some ways that you could definitely include that.
Can you utilize bees in some way in the wildlife management plan rather than just in the ag valuation?
There's not a way to quantify bee use in regards to wildlife. They are their own standalone activity. They do have a lot of benefits in general, so I think they're very good, but there's no way to use bees as a qualifying activity. Now, you can do certain things like plant, I'm thinking of maybe, food plots for pollinators. So that would essentially kind of in a roundabout way, but no, there's no way to use bees at not traditional honeybees, or even, sometimes they'll allow for different mason bees, and there's mason bee boxes. And there literally, I learned not too long ago, there are it was over 200 native bee species in Texas alone. So there's a tremendous diversity within the bee populations of our state. But I don't currently know of any way to directly say I'm helping bees. And that's, I would say on some of these plans, I include pollinators though, whether it be bees, butterflies, hummingbirds. I would include pollinators as a target species if the activities that you're doing are directly benefiting them. That's possible.
What do you recommend for Johnson grass control? It's becoming a major issue for us.
Johnson grass, glyphosate, Roundup, it might kill us too now from what I'm learning, but that's usually pretty effective. There are several. Johnson grass is not too difficult to kill, but it usually does require chemicals. I know a lot of folks, and including myself in a lot of applications, are not necessarily too excited about spraying chemicals on the ground, particularly with Johnson grass, because sometimes it grows in areas that are closer or may want to be in drainages and things like that. But yeah, there are some pretty effective control. And one of the things with certain plants, they're just hard to kill in general. And so you want to have as I mentioned earlier, you want to have a focused approach. You want to understand that it's probably going to take more than one application if you're able to get in there and treat them. And then they're always easier, as you started mentioning, it's becoming a problem. Now is definitely the time before it gets worse.
How do we get a biologist to come out to our property and evaluate what we could do with less than 20 acres?
Well, one way is to pay you pay us to do it. There are several options. I used to work with the state, with Texas Parks and Wildlife. They offer services similar to that, where they may come out. The problem lies in the fact that because they do a lot of different things, they may not be as responsive. There are several different entities that could come. Private companies usually are pretty responsive because it's what we do. Depending on the size of the acreage and depending on the history, that's one of the first things we look at. If your intent is to go into wildlife management for tax valuation, we would look at those things. If your intent is just to do things that are going to benefit the wildlife, then I think that almost any biologist would be happy to come talk to you about those things. And then I think we have some specific services depending on what your exact needs are, that would be a site visit or a consulting site visit. Sometimes we have what we would call a pre-planned consultation. And that may be if you're thinking about doing wildlife management, but you're not really certain, you want to visit with a biologist and see if, is it suitable? Is this something I really want to commit to? Then we do that. And that's somewhat as a more or less a site visit where we go and we talk about all these things, and then you pay for it. But if you decide to move forward with the plan, we gather everything that we would need to develop that plan on that visit. So then we just subtract the cost of that visit from the total cost of the plan. So there are several different ways that you could get someone out, at least within our company, or even other places. You could probably find people that would come and give you that information for sure.
I have 18 acres in Fort Bend County, Rosenberg city limits. They have cattle now and would like to add something else. Do you think it is possible? I don't have any more information than that, Tucker. We might need a little bit more.
They want to probably want to do away with the cattle. I'm going to assume that they're looking to do something different. 18 acres would be suitable for beekeeping. The beekeeping requirement says that it has to be between 5 and 20 acres. It would also be suitable for wildlife management. Now in Fort Bend County, they used to say, oh, you got to have at least 20 acres, and they still have a 20-acre requirement for ag and some of those uses. But the wildlife management is actually set up a little differently. And so as long as the property didn't decrease in size, and the year before you're applying, if it had 1D1, which would be cattle, like let's say they kept it in cattle up until the year in which they applied and it didn't shrink in size that year, then it should be eligible for wildlife management as well. So you have several options of what they could do depending on the property. I know some of these requirements, I think Fort Bend, you could even do an orchard. They require, I think, like 5 or so acres or 10 acres for an orchard. So they have different spatial requirements based on the activities, but as long as it was previously 1D1, it's eligible to move into wildlife management. And that being said, I've written, just in this last year, I wrote a wildlife plan for 2.04 acres that it met the standard, met the requirements. Now I did, in those instances on those really small acreages, I'll call the appraisal district and say, hey, look, I want you to look at this because everything that indicates to us that this is a go-ahead deal. You know, it's got meets all the requirements. We just want to make sure that you see it the same way, just because we don't want to get involved with these issues and then not have them come out the way that we want, you know. And so sometimes they would be very hesitant on a 2-acre property to allow for it. But honestly, it's pretty cut and dried. If it meets the standard, it's eligible. And then I could probably look, if you reach out, I can look at and discuss some of the specific things. You know, I could come up with hey, here's the 3 or 4 different opportunities, things that you could do as far as agriculture. But I'm certain that wildlife would be among them.
If you gift a part of your property that already has a wildlife management valuation to a family member, will it transfer with the property?
No, the history is tied to the property. So the way that if there's a legal name change, and this is just a property tax issue, if you ever change the legal name of the ownership, whether it's a gift or whether it's you changing it from your personal ownership to an LLC, or you know, in the event sometimes people get a divorce and properties get split, any legal change in ownership necessitates refiling whatever the use was. So even if it were cattle, you'd have to refile a 1D1 ag application for continuing cattle use, even if the use didn't change because the ownership changed. And so what would happen then is they would probably request a refile of the existing plan, in which you could really provide the same plan, amend the acreage and amend the ownership, but essentially do the same thing. So it would just be an update rather than a whole new plan. But unfortunately, because there would be a change in ownership, that would require updating the paperwork with the appraisal district.
And that looks to be all the questions for the evening.
And guys, if I tried and talked a lot and tried to answer your questions, but I didn't really, or if you have any additional, you know, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to discuss these things, at least. And if I can't address it or don't know the answer, I can get you in touch with someone who does.
Thanks, Tucker. Great job tonight. Thank you, everybody listening in. Really appreciate y'all's time. And again, be looking forward to a follow-up email from me tomorrow. It will include a copy of this recorded presentation, the copy of the slides, and our contact information to follow up. So Everybody have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.